Yeah, but she has.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean they would know where it's superior.
No, but they can.
So they can't make it any bigger.
He has to sign it. Okay. You file it and you record it. I already put it in for it. And I'm going to put once tonight. I'm going to take it down to Chemung County Clerk's office.
So it's next up to that?
Betty.
Fire it up.
Well, sir. She says she's got another connector if you don't have
The connector right here.
Yes, super. It's just like to push it. It's hit the button once, then hit it again. The display, push the display. Sure. Yep. I can sit over on that side. Recording it, so I'll need to just start that down.
That's what I feel was going.
Hey, can you do me a favor if you have a smartphone? I need to check and see where this is. I'm trying to see. Hey.
What's up?
Holly. Can you do me a favor? Sit next to you. Yeah, can you take a look and see if this is where the link is, and then share it on the post that I have about this on the committee page. Because it's live, but I just don't know where it is yet. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right.
So you can just hit the first
right.
one.
Yep.
And I'm going to plug this in, so that's not right.
Okay. Yeah, sure you get power.
This is the other thing.
Stripping me.
When I saw Randy yesterday, he also said he was very upset at Andy for doing this. That there wasn't fair balance because the EPA wasn't here to defend itself. He sounds like they hear him.
Yeah, like see if this is on my personal page, like the stream. So share that. Okay. Copy link. And put it on the post, like committee post. You know what I mean?
Is that better, folks? Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I've got it right here. Yeah, Wednesday. Okay, we'll get started. Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Andy Petros. I'm a lifelong resident of Chemung County. Sorry about that. Lived in Southport for nearly 30 years. I want to take a few minutes to provide some background related to our involvement. When I meant our, Jim Hare and my wife couldn't make it tonight. Our involvement with the issue of toxic hazards at Southside High School, which is now Elmira High School. Our son graduated in Southside High School in June of 1997, and in October of 97 was diagnosed with malignant testicular cancer. He underwent chemo treatment and is now a proud father of 2 boys. Our family was very fortunate with our son's health outcome. In the spring of 1999, while my wife was working as an RN at St. Joe's, a fellow employee said to her, "Well, what's going on with students getting cancer at Southside?" We had no other children, so we really had no consistent connection to Southside High School. We then decided to contact Jim Hare, from our city councilman, and at that time, Jim was still teaching at the school. Jim invited us to his home along with Dan Royal, another city councilman, as well as another family at that time whose son was diagnosed with testicular cancer. We decided to compose some questions and begin an inquiry with the Elmira City School District. That was May of 1999. Over the next 4 years, a process of investigation was initiated with the New York State Department of Health, New York State DEC, various law firms, one hired by the school district, one hired by the city of Elmira, and other members of the community involved, that ultimately resulted in the formation of an advisory committee, and many open community meetings were held. The New York State Department of Health declared their investigation closed in the fall. Monitoring were implemented within the school property, and I believe that our group can claim some responsibility for at least the initiation of those action items. But many questions obviously remain, and this is what brings us here this evening. I was interviewed by Gannett reporter Tom Wilbur in February of this year for an article he was working on titled "Environmental Sins of the Past on Southern Tier Communities," and that led me to making contact with Walter Hang. Obviously, given my involvement in the past,
Thank you. It's very nice to meet Andy face to face, and it's very nice to see all of you here. So, I'm with a firm called Toxics Targeting. We're an environmental database company, and all we do is compile government data. So you'll be happy to hear I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm not trying to get hired by you in any fashion. The data that I'm going to walk through tonight is essentially posted for your review as a courtesy at toxicstargeting.com. Click in the summary section in the lower right-hand corner, and you'll see toxic legacy sites, and you'll see Elmira data. So I'm going to walk you through the data. As Andy, I think, eloquently pointed out, this is information for all of you. How many of you went to the school or had children or friends or family who went to the school? Okay. So I think the reality is when this school was built on a former factory site that had never been properly cleaned up or even investigated on a comprehensive basis, this was a relatively new phenomenon. And as I'm sure you know, these are now called brownfields. A brownfield is a contaminated property that impairs the property from its best use. And so this site basically had a school put on top of it, and essentially the authorities have been responding to that effort ever since. So let me tell you a little bit about toxic targeting. And you can go to my website, you can basically see what's going on. And so what toxic targeting does is, again, we compile government data, and we track now about 850,000 known and potential sites all over the state of New York. So we have very, very detailed data going back all the way as far as the 19th century. So this is the biggest report that my company ever did, and this is where traditionally 500,000 people have gotten drinking water from the ground in Queens, New York. Next slide. And so what toxic targeting did was we mapped and profiled all these different categories of known and potential toxic sites. What's a potential toxic site? It would be like a buried tank for heating oil or gasoline, but it hasn't leaked. It's just sitting down there holding the petroleum, but it could leak. That's why it's a potential problem. A known problem would be a site that actually leaked, or there was illegal dumping, or there was some kind of an uncontrolled release, and it polluted a water well, it polluted homes, or people came in direct contact with the contamination. So these sites commonly involve petroleum, chlorinated solvents, polychlorinated biphenyls. These are many of the same issues you're going to hear about tonight. And so my company simply gets all of those data, and we map and we profile it. And so this was, again, for a drinking water study. Next slide. And so after we, go back one.
Sorry? I'll get it, Wolf.
After we went through 27,000 sites, we identified high concerns. And so they got a special mark, and then we compiled very detailed data on those individual sites which threaten 53 well fields. So it's a way that you can look at the data and say, where are there problems, where are there not problems, according to government data. Next slide. And with the data, the city of New York sued ExxonMobil and won $104.7 million for polluting the drinking water in Jamaica, Queens. Next slide. And that award was affirmed. So MTBE, methyl tertiary butyl ether, is an additive in gasoline, and that basically polluted the wells because the MTBE migrates really far where the gasoline itself doesn't. Next slide. So this is your site. And so what toxic targeting did, all we did was we located what's called the site remediation boundary, and that's this speckled area. And then we essentially compiled all of the available data for that area, and then we mapped and profiled the sites. And so the yellow highlighted sites at my website, you just click them and you link to the site profiles. This is the government data verbatim. But it's tricky to get this information because some of the information is redacted. And so if you go to the Department of Environmental Conservation's website and you look at a spill profile, you're missing 3 key data fields. Does the spill meet applicable cleanup standards? Caller remarks and DEC investigator remarks. Again, that's Department of Environmental Conservation. So my company has all of those data. Next slide. So as you know, there are 2 portions of this former factory site, and that's the location. Next slide. And so as I'm sure you know, 34-acre site is fully developed as the Elmira High School. This is the government's own information, and you can go through it. And as everyone knows, this was basically a very, very large manufacturing operation for more than a century. So you can look at these profiles on your own, and basically it has a description of the site geology, the hydrology, because if the pollution is dumped into the ground, it doesn't just sit there, it can migrate. And you're going to see that's exactly what's happened. Next slide. So basically, there was a groundwater sampling after oil showed up in a nearby pond circa 1995. The problem is that there has never been a comprehensive investigation. They've done a whole series of site characterizations, but they still don't know where all the pollution is, where it's going, where it's gone. And it's gone as far as maybe 7 miles away from the site. So it's basically in all kinds of waste structures. It's in the sewers that have collapsed. You have all kinds of polychlorinated biphenyls at the surface soils. PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, are primary contaminants of concern. Significant areas, acres, and depth of PCB impacted soil. So PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, are, as I'm sure you know, a very, very persistent oil. They're very thermally stable. They're used in electrical devices. They used to be used in all kinds of industrial applications. And PCBs are very toxic, and they're potentially cancer-causing. And this is the contaminant that polluted the Hudson River, where I'm from, for 200 miles. So once you get 50 parts per million of PCBs, that's hazardous waste. And they found up to 33,930 parts per million. So that's a phenomenal amount of PCB hazardous waste. And then you can see, as you know, as Andy noted, one of the critical issues is soil vapor impacted with volatile organic compounds, primarily TCE or trichloroethylene. So TCE is a degreasing agent. So let's say that you were going to chrome plate this metal. Before you plate it, you have to clean it, because if you just touch it, there's oil on the metal and the plating won't stick to the metal. So anything that you plate, you anodize, you paint, first you got to clean it. And that's why these solvents are so common. Because when you're making all the metal parts that were involved, you know, with the Norden bomb sight and locomotives and this, that, and the other thing, typewriters, you get oil for cutting, lubricating, then you got to clean the oil off. That's why you have so much of this solvent material. Next slide. So what I did here was I delineated the entire site on an aerial photograph, and then I overlaid it on a 1950 historic map. And so these are what are called Sanborn fire insurance maps. So I'm going to pass this around, and you can see things noted like oil house, right? So you care a great deal about oil because oil is persistent, it's toxic, and it can migrate. So you want to know at this facility where were the activities were oil, PCBs, and solvents handled? Where were they dumped? Where might they have been spilled? And for a big old factory that operated for 100 years, you're going to have what they call housekeeping problems, but you can have enormous contamination. It's not like people were evil. It's just in the 19th century, that's just the way they did things. They lost a lot of material. So I'm making these available. You can find them online, Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps. And I invite you, if you know people that used to work at this facility, try to figure out where might there have been tanks that leaked, spills that might have occurred in decades going by because a valve broke or something like that. And that information will help identify where the hazards are so that they can be assessed and cleaned up. And you're going to be shocked at how much of this site still hasn't been cleaned up. Next slide, please. So you can download this PDF at toxicstargeting.com as a courtesy, and then you can zoom in, and then you can look for all these little features, and you can see where the track is with regard to the historic factory activities. Next slide. And then you can see what portion of the operation was directly on top of the school, because the school was put on top of the site, but the site hadn't been comprehensively investigated to figure out where are the hot spots, where are the less contaminated areas, and they certainly didn't dig up all the pollution because it's still there. Next slide. And again, this is down at the southern end. So you can look at all these details. It's not crystal clear. These are ancient maps. But again, people in the neighborhood, people in the community, you may have a sense of what's going on. Next slide. So this is the hazardous waste data for the school. So I noticed two things. In 2013, 99,740 pounds wastewater treatment sludges from electroplating operations. So it's possible that the school is doing this, but probably they found it when they were digging or excavating, and you can ask them. The thing that really struck me, which fortunately is not an issue, is that I saw that they had a staggering amount of mercury hazardous waste. But it turns out, believe it or not, that this was the gymnasium floor. It was a synthetic floor that reportedly had this mercury. I spoke to the school authorities, and they said that was ripped out, and that was circa 2010. And I actually Googled this. I had never even heard of this. And so the mercury was in this synthetic material. So I don't think that that's an issue unless they didn't get it all. But it sounded like they put a lot of effort into it. Next slide. So you can go through and you can see all of the waste that were generated over the course of time, and you can try to correlate that with the activities at the school. Next slide. Next slide. So you can see that the work basically in the north portion is underway and not yet complete. So this work has been going on for probably 25 years. Again, it was never a comprehensive effort. I think it's safe to say it was piecemeal, it was responsive, and unless this fundamental problem gets addressed, you'll never clean up this site. Next slide. Next slide. So you'll see these are all basically a lot of the same data. So in 1995, New York State Department of Environmental Conservation investigation of petroleum-related contamination near Miller Pond traced contaminant impacts back to the school property. In 2000, Elmira Central School District has expressed concern about potential exposure risks associated with the environmental conditions discovered at the high school. This resulted in additional environmental assessments undertaken by New York State Department of Health and Department of Environmental Conservation. So they were making a good faith effort. The problem is they never cleaned up the site to the applicable standards. Next slide. So New York State Department of Health and this federal ATSDR concluded that breathing volatile organic compounds at the levels found in the indoor air at the school is not expected to harm people's health. The problem is that many of these compounds are cancer causing, and there's no safe level of exposure to cancer causing agents. Every exposure increases your risk a minuscule amount. Again, no one's going to breathe a little bit of TCE and keel over, okay? You can asphyxiate from it, but it's not that poisonous, it's not that potent a cancer-causing agent. It's a long-term threat. It's a chronic health threat. However, you can tell, right, they don't really know. Otherwise, they'd say there's no risk or yes, there is a risk. They said it's not expected to harm people's health. However, they recommended that actions be implemented to reduce indoor air levels of volatile organic compounds to within background ranges. Background's very tricky. If you went out in the middle of the forest, you would probably have no trichloroethylene in the air. You'd have no PCBs in the air. These are what are called synthetic anthropogenic compounds. They don't exist in nature. You go into nature, you do not find nylon, right? Nylon is manufactured, it's synthetic. This cup, synthetic, right? So it's not in nature. So generally speaking, background should mean zero. And emphasize the need for continued operation of the HVAC, heating, ventilating, air conditioning, and vapor mitigation systems. So the problem is we now know that some of these compounds can cause air pollution in the what's called ambient air. So you'll see that there are areas where they actually just covered them with mulch. And so when the sun is beating down on that PCB contaminated dirt, the PCBs can volatilize. This is absolutely well known. It's completely documented. And so the problem is if you happen to be walking by that area or you touch that material, you can be exposed to those chemicals. So they wanted to try to keep the air moving in the building using the HVAC, it sounds like. And this would try to vent out the air pollution that's accumulating in the building. So this is what's happening. If you have toxic contamination in the ground, it doesn't like being in the ground because of that entropy that we all studied in high school. The molecules want to be really far apart from one another. So if someone over here has aftershave on or someone over here has perfume on, the next thing you know, you smell it over there. Those molecules are trying to get out of the ground to the atmosphere. Unfortunately, if it comes up underneath a foundation slab, it can't get through the foundation slab unless there's a crack, a hole, a floor drain, or some other utility conduit opening. So what they were trying to do is blow out the air underneath the foundation with big fans and vents. And this then vents the air under the foundation to the atmosphere. This is just what they do for radon. So if you vent the air under the foundation, you depressurize that area, and then the pollutants can be vented to the atmosphere before they come up into the school. That's the theory. The problem is that they haven't, I don't believe, installed sub-slab, under the slab, depressurization systems for the entire school. And that's how come they recently discovered trichloroethylene and and another compound. I got to check the list. But they actually found it in the school, and they said it was in an area that did not, carbon tetrachloride, that was it. They didn't actually have subslab depressurization in that area. So if you don't have good subslab depressurization, if you haven't sealed all the cracks, if you haven't sealed all the openings, the pollution can come in. In addition, if you have air pollution around the school, that can come in when people open doors and windows and things like that. This is not usually an issue when there's a lot of in and out in the building, right? Where people have windows open, things like that. It's mainly an issue in the wintertime during the heating season. So I don't know how this school is heated, but if they're burning natural gas or fuel oil or anything like that, that actually creates a slight vacuum and it will draw the pollution into the structure. Then once it's in the structure, with all the windows and doors closed to save heating, that's how come you get the indoor air pollution. Okay, next slide. So this is another section, and this one is a significant threat to the public health or environment. Action required. Next slide. And basically, this is a very small area where historically combined storm and industrial sewer discharges were off-site. So storm water is during a rain event, the water just washes off the factory site, goes into the storm drain, and it goes off into an adjoining body of water. And then there were also sewer discharges, but as you'll see, those leaked. So this one incident, the investigation of an oily sludge release, documents poorly maintained oil separators at this facility as a probable cause. And they identified problems from the mid-1940s through the early 70s. And they said a documented fish kill incident downstream was the result of one cyanide release in the 1950s. And then they said a PCB transformer oil spill was documented in the 1970s during the decommissioning of the site. Site-related contaminants appear to have been released to an off-site tributary marsh that empties into Coldbrook Creek. Preliminary sampling of this off-site area was conducted by DEC in 2000, and during the Scott Technologies Voluntary Cleanup Program remedial investigation. So they basically identified elevated levels of PCBs and heavy metals along with low levels of semi-volatile organic compounds. So these problems are very, very widespread. Next slide. So you can see very high levels of chrome, barium, arsenic, cadmium, lead, 1,410. The allowable amount is only 400. And basically it says historic sediment sampling from Coldbrook Creek downstream of tributary wash has detected low levels. So it's hit or miss. It can accumulate in one area very low and other areas very high. So don't go walking in this area because you'll be exposed. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So these were the confirmed hazardous waste disposed of. Arachlor is a brand of PCBs. Chrysene is a polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbon. Benzoate pyrene is a chemical in cigarette smoke that can cause lung cancer. But they don't know how much was dumped, when it was dumped. This is a classic legacy toxic site. And so basically, it's still a question mark what's going on here. Next slide. So this is in 2001. Inspected Coldbrook Creek with local resident to check on a report of oily sediments found in the creek. Inspection verified oily sediments found at the junction of Coldbrook Creek with an unnamed creek emanating from a pond found at the north end of former American La France facility. Sediments previously sampled by DER staff from Hazardous Waste Program. Sediments at depth also have oily odor and appearance, and then again they detected these other compounds. Don't touch these materials. Don't get in a situation where you may not get adequate oxygen. Like, don't go into any kind of confined space. Don't go near these sites, because you can get contamination in your shoes, you can track it in your house. Like, just stay away. Don't let kids play in these areas. Next slide. This was a site, it was originally a hazardous substance site, and this was one that just was never included in the adequate cleanup efforts. Next slide. Next slide. So you can read through these elevated levels of lead, chromium, and polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons. So there's just year after year of finding problems. Next slide. Okay, so you get the idea. Decades and decades of discovering problems, investigating them on kind of a hit or miss basis, remediating some issues, but not doing it on a comprehensive basis. And so you can go to the fact sheet. These are all available. I think the school has posted these. And so they want to further reduce the potential for contaminated soil vapors to migrate to indoor air. They installed the subslab depressurization systems. 2014, they found PCBs in the soil in several areas. And basically, they're struggling to come to grips with this problem. I think that they're doing their best. It's just not enough. And they haven't even begun, again, to deal with these off-site issues since 2010. So it's, again, endless delay, which doesn't have to be accepted. Next slide. So I'll post these all. You can look at them at toxicstargeting.com, and I highlighted the key portions for your review. Next slide. Next slide. So here's the northern portion that we've been talking about. The southern portion really hasn't even been investigated yet. Then you got this off-site waterway issue where all the contamination was in the sediments, and the cyanide migrated maybe 7 miles away. Cyanide is used to harden metal. So it's very, very toxic, as I'm sure you know. You can see there's some more ball fields down here. So again, don't go in those areas. Next slide. So now I'm just going to walk you through the DEC's own PowerPoint, but I'm going to try to explain better what's going on. So what they're trying to do is expedited soil cleanup. But the problem is, again, it's like 25 years after these problems came to light. So there's your school, the fields, etc. Next slide. So there's the old factory. Next slide. So they now have found basic ongoing, problems being investigated involving former industrial sewers. So you dump all the crap in the sewers. It's supposed to go to the wastewater treatment plant, but if the sewers have structural flaws, then the contamination can just leak out. An oil skimmer is the oil floats on top of the water. So imagine if you have a little dam. So the water is up against the dam, but imagine where the water can go underneath the dam. So the oil backs up. The oil gets skimmed off. The problem is that oil can be very, very toxic. Former dry wells. So these are dry wells. They dump the contamination into the dry wells. It causes on-site contamination. If you dump it into an on-site wastewater treatment system, like a septic tank, a leaching field, those are designed for human waste, trichloroethylene, PCBs, heavy metals. Those don't get broken down. So you actually cause contamination problems that way. Plating, remember I told you, degreasing, painting. This all involves cleaning the metal before you paint it and plate it. And so those degreasing solvents, they traditionally just got dumped. Former waste areas, so this is on-site dumping. In the 19th century, they would have probably just buried a lot of this stuff, particularly if there were nearby wetlands, if there were marshy areas, those would all be filled. So one of the things that should be done is you can look at a topographic map from, let's say, 1850, and then you can see where the waterways and wetlands are, just like those historic maps, right? You want to see what used to be there And if that's now the school, that's probably going to involve fill. And then the key issues, ground, soil, and groundwater contamination, and soil gas vapor intrusions. These are all the issues that I've been talking to you about this evening. Next slide. So, this is where they found polychlorinated biphenyls in the soil.
Look at the football field.
This is clearly delineated. You can see what the references are. This is 2017, primary contaminants of concern, PCBs. Next slide. So you can see the cleanup areas are much limited, right? They didn't clean up everything. Next slide. So now you can see where they conducted sampling. So the rule is seek and ye shall find. So you can see they sampled a lot in certain areas and then nothing in other areas. If you don't look, you can't find. You can see here, it's kind of a grid, right? That's what you want. You want a checkerboard. Like you want every 10 feet, 15 feet. You don't want to miss anything because you could see from that other map, these are discrete areas. For some reason, you have a lot of pollution here and nothing over there. Maybe there was a dry well. Maybe they dumped stuff decades ago. These are very persistent compounds. But you can see they did not investigate on a comprehensive basis. It's hard to investigate through the foundation slab. You have to drill through the slab, and then you have to collect a sample of the air with what's called a SUMMA canister. S-U-M-M-A. The SUMMA canister is pressurized. It sucks in some of the air. Then they send it to the lab, and they test that sample of air. And if you have toxics, you'll know it. Next slide. So now these are where they have those contaminants. And you can see it's kind of here, it's there, and this is very likely due to historic activities. Not all of these areas have been cleaned up yet. Next slide. So what they did was they installed a temporary cover systems. Like they put grass over it, you know. That's just not adequate, right? And in other areas, temporary cover installation, hardwood mulch with geotextile, it's like a plastic layer, right? So again, that's not a comprehensive solution. And the problem obviously is that these areas were not covered until recently. So people have been exposed to these areas by potentially walking on them, rolling around on them, playing sports on them in decades gone by. So this is really not a good situation. Next slide. So now in the shallow subsurface soils, you can see, again, they have found much more contamination involving soil cleanup objective exceedances, right? So these are areas where they say you got too much contamination and you should be cleaning this up to the residential standard. You should not allow industrial standard because obviously kids are coming in contact potentially with at least some of these areas. Next slide. And so you can also see that there is groundwater contamination. So a lot of these oils and solvents and PCBs will not dissolve in water, but they can float on the water. Or fuel oil, for example, will float on the water. Gasoline will float on the water. If you see the phrase LNAPL, light non-aqueous phase liquid, that's the stuff floating on the water. Trichloroethylene, that's a DNAPL, dense non-aqueous phase liquid. So if you pour TCE into groundwater, it sinks. It goes right through the groundwater. That's why it's so hard to clean up, because it goes down, down, down. So once it gets in the groundwater, it can keep migrating down. It doesn't migrate quickly, but in the course of 20, 30 years, you can have very, very deep pollution. And that pollution, again, as I told you, it's always trying to get to the atmosphere. So it will migrate around. It doesn't always go down. It can spread horizontally. And that's why all of this pollution, if at all possible, has got to be removed. You got to dig it out. Next slide. So now there are all these combined industrial sewers, sanitary sewers, stormwater sewers. And you can see they have all these collapsed sections that they identify. So if the sewer collapses, then the wastewater can leak out. And that contaminated wastewater can basically cause groundwater and soil contamination. So again, you can see all these delineated areas of exceedances. This is what the government data are allowing you to figure out. And you can say, did my kid run track? Where's the pole vault? What's on the baseball field? Blah, blah, blah. These maps are very, very easy to interpret once you have someone to kind of walk you through it the first time. Next slide. So these are interim remedial measure objectives. These are not compliance measures that strictly fulfill the letter and the spirit of the law. So IRMs are just kind of, we're doing this now, you know, maybe we'll do better years down the line. So this is not really what you want. So they remove soils that exceeded cleanup goals for PCBs in 2 areas, tennis courts and main visitors parking lot, and they apply the restricted residential soil cleanup objective. You really want the unrestricted. You want it as clean as possible. And since you have a very, very, you know, big, probably Fortune 500 firm that has insurance coverage, why wouldn't the state enforce comprehensive, strict compliance with the law? There really is no reason to accept interim remedial measures. So if you want to protect public health and protect groundwater, you know, really got to remove the pollution. It's as simple as that. That's the only way to solve the problem. Next slide. So they did the tennis courts, they did the parking lot. Next slide. And now these are the future remedial measures. So they're going to do this area in 2018. They did these areas in 2017. And these areas to be coordinated with future construction, Elmira City School District construction. So they're going to leave it there until there are, I guess, more capital improvements. That is a dubious policy decision. Next slide. Oh, wait 1 second. You're good. Okay. Next slide. So this is that soil vapor intrusion that I talked to you about. This is the Department of Health. The contamination is in the groundwater. It's trying to get to the atmosphere. It comes up under the slab, under your basement, or crawl space. It can get in. Next slide. You can look at the trichloroethylene standards. They're very, very low. There really is no safe level. Next slide. Same thing for perchloroethylene. This is a dry cleaning solvent. There really is no safe level of exposure. And when you're exposed to multiple chemicals, you can have synergistic effects. You can have multiplicative effects. Next slide. And then they haven't even dealt with all of the off-site waterways.
That's right.
So this is another issue. You say, why hasn't this been done in 25 years? It really doesn't make any sense.
Agreed.
There's no benefit in delay. You just give them a drop-dead deadline. Either you clean this up or we're going to clean it up and we're going to come after you to, basically compensate the state of New York. And if the federal authorities do it, they can sue for treble damages. There's no reason to accept this delay. So again, you see, another report, another analysis, public's going to get informed, trying to look at more PCBs and metals, additional delineation. They really just should clean this problem up. Next slide. So then you get down to the former Scott technology. So they're still delineating these problems. Documenting the findings, recommending the next course of action, remedial investigation, remedial cleanup. I mean, this should have happened like decades ago as far as I'm concerned. I'm not casting aspersions on anyone. But this is the whole issue. when you know that you have a contaminated site, you got to investigate it on a comprehensive basis. You got to clean it up. The longer you don't clean it up, the more the pollution migrates. The more it migrates, the more hard it is to clean it up. There's no benefit in delay. It's like saying, I smell smoke in a house. I think I'll deal with it 3 years from now. But your house is going to burn down. Next slide. So you want to know what comprehensive cleanup looks like? I'm going to show you because I've dedicated almost 20 years of my life to cleaning up Ithaca, New York. So we found out about manufactured gas plant contamination at this site. Before there was natural gas, there was manufactured gas. So they would heat coal in these big metal vessels called retorts. And when they cooked out the gas, you'd be left with that clinker coal material that a lot of us used to run on at tracks, that cinder material. That's what's left over after you cook out the gas. The problem is you also get coal tar, benzoate pyrene, benzoate anthracene. These are the same compounds in cigarette smoke that cause lung cancer. So this is a 120-foot long, 60-foot wide sprung structure, and that brick building is where the retorts were. And this is on West Court Street in Ithaca, New York. Next slide. So there's big blowers connected to granular activated carbon air filters. And you see these huge garage doors. So the heavy equipment just drives in through these doors, and then inside, this big fan is drawing clean air in from louvers on the other side, pass it through the carbon filter. And they dug out all of the polluted dirt down to 15 feet below grade. Next slide. And so they drove sheet pile with this huge pneumatic hammer 53 feet into the ground so the coal tar couldn't spread. They had all these blue magoos. There's one on the other street, I think to the west when I got off of the expressway. These are portable groundwater treatment systems. They're called blue magoos. You can see here they're portable groundwater treatment systems. These are fractionation tanks. There's the sprung structure. Next slide. So here's the sheet pile, 53 feet below grade. They're spraying biosol. And this huge excavator is digging up all the polluted dirt. And there was a house here that had 10 inches of coal tar. Next slide. So here's another area, same thing, big excavator. There is a Catholic school. You can see this sheet pile is like 3/4 of an inch, 53 feet below grade. You can see all the piles of contaminated dirt. This is in cold weather, so there was very little volatilization. They sprayed all this biosolve on top of it. Next slide. They dug out all of the utilities because the utilities are preferential pathways. Sewers, water lines, gas and electric lines, as you may know, they have to be at the right angle. So they typically sit in crushed rock, riprap, gravel, stuff like that. So once the pollution gets into those voids, it just follows that pathway. So they dug everything out. That's source removal. And you can see this is one heavy-duty undertaking. So when I showed this to our Department of Environmental Conservation Commissioner, Pete Granis, he was shocked. And then he leaned over and he looked at Dale Denoyers, the head of site remediation, and he said, "Are we doing this anywhere else in New York State?" And I'll never forget what Dale said. He said, "Well, we would like to, and so you can get this kind of remedial effort, but it's not going to be given to you without a fight." You can see how close the homes are. Next slide. This, by the way, is all paid for 100% by the responsible party, NYSEG. They had insurance. And so now you can see it's a ball field. The house is gone. Next slide. All new utilities, all new roadways. Next slide. And that's pretty much it. So you're a classic legacy toxic site. The contamination has never been fully investigated. It's never been remediated. And if you don't take comprehensive action, you're going to just go through years and years of it. This is the Morse chain fact sheet that just came out last week. And so this site was identified 31 years ago to have extensive toxic pollution hazards. This is a significant threat to the public health. Action is required. Then they did a very limited cleanup, and they said it's fine. Site properly cleaned up, continued maintenance required, that's class 4. And then when I showed that this site hadn't been properly cleaned up, they reclassified it as a 2. Last week, they reported 7 feet of oil found in an abandoned well, and very high levels of vinyl chloride, which is a known human cancer-causing agent. And basically, this is the classic story of how you can just delay. This report was a 32,000-page report. They will study these sites until we're all dead and gone if we let them. So we have to, I believe, enforce the law. Finally, you can go to toxicstargeting.com, and as a courtesy, you can type in your address or any address you are concerned about in New York at the Home Buyers Beware Toxic Site Map. And then you can see basically, where toxic sites have been reported. And in conclusion, I believe your site, like Morse Chain and like Ithaca Gun, which has lead contamination that was just revealed, should be reclassified as a classification code 1 site. You have a 2, but I think these should all be 1s, causing or presenting an imminent danger of causing irreversible or irreparable damage to the public health or environment. Immediate action required. Unless there's a drop-dead deadline, these sites are never going to get cleaned up. And as Tom Wilbur noted, there are more than 1,000 of them across New York State. So you're not alone. This is our toxic legacy. This was all supposed to be cleaned up years and years ago, but it hasn't. And so that's why we've got to, I think, take further action to protect public health, protect the environment. But that's my opinion. You'll have to make up your own minds. Okay, thank you so much. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
Thanks, Walter. That was excellent.
Whatever you said, please feel free.
We live on Milton Street, and I'm pretty sure there's a lot of toxicity over there. Not only do we have the sewer plant in our backyard, but we have a lot of waterways around our area, a lot of fields. When we purchased our house in the year 2000, after we closed, my uncle, who worked at the American LaFrance Company, said, "Oh, if I had known you were buying over there, I would have told you not to." We used to bury barrels over there. And it was a very common thing way back when. So on your site, you didn't have anything that showed Milton Street or that entire area. In the years that we've been there, we have watched dog, cat, and people die of cancer over and over and over. So whatever site you have, I'm anxious to see if Milton Street is on that map.
Well, first, that company was referenced in one of those documents at least, okay? So again, go to toxicstargeting.com. You can read these documents. It's not like reading the back of a cereal box, but you can figure it out. They're, for the most part, written in a way where you can understand the acronyms and the like. So if you find that a company dumped in your area, then you could try to figure out how is that past dumping going to impact me, my pets, my neighborhood. There has to be a way for the pollution to migrate in your direction. And so that's what's called a fate and transport model. Regarding people getting sick, when I was a little junior cancer researcher at Roswell Park in Buffalo, I was going to cure cancer in one summer. And I killed every single one of my patients. And they were 6 months to 4.5 years old. They were little kids, and they had rhabdomyosarcoma. And that, at the time, was an invariably fatal form of cancer. So in the summer of 75, 1 in 4 would get cancer, 2/3 would die of cancer. And you may many of you are probably around the age where you remember that so-called cancer atlas. So New Jersey had the highest cancer mortality rate in the nation. Mortality means you die of it. Morbidity means you get sick from it. But New York was a hair behind. We were number 2 in terms of mortality. And so if you get exposed to cancer-causing agents, your risk goes up. Again, you're not going to immediately get sick and very likely die. But if you work in a factory and you're handling these toxic chemicals, like a lot of parents, and grandparents in this community did, they had health hazards that they contended with. So, we now know, again, 1 in 3 will get it. Now they'll get cancer, 2/3 will die. So in any group, you're going to have a lot of people that are going to get sick and die of cancer. There's no way around that. But you can take action to prevent your exposure. That's how come you think I'm a lunatic when I tell people don't walk in these areas that are mapped. Oh, they say, oh, look at that oil. Oh, I love iridescent sheens. Oh, it's just like a rainbow. It's like, don't touch that. And so I did a lot of low-income housing loan transactions in this area maybe 10 years ago. And I looked at a lot of these sites. The Kentucky Avenue Wellfield is on my website. I looked at that a long time ago. So you can type in your address, and if you call me, Walter at Toxics Targeting, I'll try to help you. I can't promise. I can't deal with everyone. I got to run a company. But I think, you can find out what's going on around your homes. You can figure out what's going on around your schools. Schools are very, very plentiful. In Little Ithaca, South Hill Elementary is across the street from the chain factory. The high school where my kids went to school and Fall Creek Elementary are down gradient from Ithaca Gun, which has massive lead contamination and solvent contamination. So trust no one. Look at the data, read the data profiles, and then you can make up your own minds about what's going on. You see buried barrels? That's the classic sign. Back up. Don't go near. If you smell a strong chemical odor, don't get too close because you can asphyxiate. You can get woozy and fall down and you can't get away. So if you find these problems, you can call the spill hotline. You just got to get the authorities to be more responsive to Elmira's needs. That's what I think.
You said that NICEAG had to pay for the Ithaca cleanup. Who's going to pay for this when all these factories have been gone for decades? Who's going to pay for Elmira?
Unisys. They're a responsible party. They signed an agreement. They have insurance coverage. So any entity that had insurance coverage is called comprehensive general liability insurance coverage pre-1983, right? So after 1983, there's a pollution liability exclusion, right? They're no longer covered. But this company was there, and their successor entities were there way before that. That's how come, basically what government should do is try to get the responsible parties to agree comprehensive investigation, comprehensive cleanup. And then you say to them, we'll give you, 6 months to make up your mind. If you don't do it, we're going to do it. We're going to sue you. And if we don't do it, we're going to get the Environmental Protection Agency to do it. They're going to sue you for treble damages. Well, you may say, well, the EPA isn't going to clean up anything. Well, I got the EPA to go to Ithaca, New York last Wednesday, and they're beginning yet another remedial effort. So you got to identify the problem, and people like you, I'm sure, they're very intelligent. You can learn how to get quoted in the New York Times. Because I actually think I contacted Andy first because I saw that he was quoted by Jacques Steinberg. Jacques Steinberg was a wonderful reporter, and he went all over New York and actually identified these problems. Unfortunately, there was insufficient follow-through. You didn't have a lunatic like me to keep reading the documents, keep generating press, keep getting people to sign, so that you can get these sites cleaned up.
What are the autoimmune effects of like PCP or PCB exposure?
So I'm not an immunologist. So one of the things that you can do is you can go through all of these data, and you can see there are lots of compounds that are identified. And then you can basically do Medlar's toxic site searches, you can go to the, basically the compilations of data, and you'll see they'll have every study that's been done around the world. The problem is no one's ever looked at it very likely from that particular perspective, right? And so you can write a letter and say, this is what I require. Because I think they're actually having a meeting in about a month to talk about this. So I really believe on many, many levels, this is about a community educating itself and taking action. If you just think you're going to, rant and rave on Facebook and then the authorities are just going to like jump to your beck and call, that's probably not going to happen. You're going to have to get better organized. But you have a valid question. That's why we have a Department of Health. But you have to really focus. You have to make sure this follows through.
To your knowledge, has there ever been an effort to locate former employees from these areas and try to ascertain where some of these toxic substances were dumped?
So my little claim to fame was that in 1983, with essentially, New York State Authority, I basically got the governor to do community right to know. And community right to know required every hazardous waste generator in New York State to disclose past dumping practices. This is very similar to a provision of the federal Superfund called 103C. So all these companies were supposed to do exactly what you noted. They had to survey their workers, they had to go through their internal records, and they had to figure out, well, where did all the crap go in decades gone by where no one really thought about it? We're not saying they're evil, we're not saying they did anything improper. Those were just the ways that people disposed of waste in decades gone by. But, I would suggest, number one, if you know anyone who knows about dumping practices, this is the time to get in touch with Tom Wilbur, who's a wonderful long-form reporter. You have to get press coverage. You have press here tonight. All your local stations, get in contact with them. Again, don't expose yourself to contamination. But if you can see barrels sticking out of the ground at an old dump, that's the story, right? It's that the authorities didn't do a comprehensive job of investigating and remediating these sites.
Is there any real chance that this problem can be actually solved to the point where people won't be getting cancer anymore?
Well, we don't know anyone's getting cancer per se, right? And let me just note, the only way you can really figure that out is you have to look at two groups that are socioeconomically the same, except one group has the dependent variable where they're exposed to one chemical, a bunch of chemicals, a dump, drank contaminated water. So these are called multivariate regression analyses. They're very, very difficult to undertake. So what they typically do is they do case comparison studies. So they look at your community, let's say, and they say, oh, there's a lot of kids with testicular cancer, but we don't know why, and we don't know if that's really unusual, right? So we don't know if people are getting sick or not getting sick, but we do know that it's required to prevent public exposure. And so the way you got to do it, I showed you those pictures. You got to dig this crap out. You got to dig it all out until you get to clean soil. And if you can't get to clean soil because this is all fill or this is what dumped on for 100 years, then you need plan B. And so you saw you can seal this contamination in. And it actually isn't that hard because I watch them do it in Ithaca. Those 53-foot sections of sheet pile go in like that. I mean, it's mind-blowing. It takes like 10 seconds to get this vibrating hammer system to push the sheet pile in. I mean, they did that whole block, and they went all over, moving that sprung structure with those two front-end loaders. So it can be done. It has been done. But again, you don't even know where the pollution is because it hasn't been comprehensively assessed. That is step one. You got to know where all the pollution is, and then you have to conduct what's called a fate and transport assessment. Where is it going? Where is it gone? How do we get rid of it?
So, am I correct in assuming that if they continue to do this cleanup like they're doing piecemeal, that some of the places they cleaned will then become contaminated again?
Very likely, because of what's called diffusion. So again, once you have that groundwater contamination, probably it's migrating towards that creek, right? But I don't know. You can read these incredibly detailed reports, or you can ask. So very likely that contamination is migrating towards the creek, but it hasn't all migrated away, right? So once you have pollution, it starts going through the groundwater, you get the leading edge, and then however many years or decades later, the last little smidgen finally mobilizes, and that's the trailing edge. But these sites can leak, for decades, if not centuries. That's how come you got to remove the source areas, source removal. You don't want in situ treatment. You don't want pump and treat, because the volume of groundwater is phenomenal. So pumping and treating doesn't work. The other technique that they traditionally have tried to use is called air sparging. And this is where you blow air into the groundwater to try to volatilize the solvents. Then you suck all that contamination out with a big fan, a blower system. The problem is you recover very little in the course of a year, maybe a pound or two. So really, this one, I believe it deserves Class 1 designation, and I think that they have to use those SUMA canisters. They really have to monitor the air room by room. Like, why is room 127 got ambient air? I have no idea. And I just read the very certification quickly. So you have to ask these questions to the DEC. But we know that the whole school doesn't have subslab depressurization. These are very complicated matters where if you don't have enough blower capacity, you're not venting all the pollution. This sounds very straightforward, but it isn't. Heating, ventilating, and air conditioning is a very complicated engineering field. I worked on a project at Stony Brook Medical School Hospital, and there was one section that wasn't getting enough fresh air. In a typical big building, only 1/10 of the air is fresh air. The rest is recirculated, just like on an airplane. So there was one section, there was such insufficient fresh air, people were fainting. You can imagine the litigation. So this is a big structure, and you can see it's very, very heterogeneous. So I think, again, you just want to start digging out this pollution.
Not to open up a can of worms, but I'm very curious. You're talking about one site, Chemung County, by another big site. How many sites do you think there are in Chemung County that are considered Superfund and what you would consider to be a Class 1 site?
So I believe that right now in the sites that I've looked at, Morse Chain, this high school, Ithaca Gun, Ithaca Falls, Overlook, those should be Class 1s. There's never been a Class 1. Even the Love Canal was not a Class 1 because that predated the inactive hazardous waste disposal site registry. So for those of you who don't know, the Love Canal was an actual canal that was built by a guy named Love before they had alternating current. So power had to be generated, and it couldn't be transported long distances like through high tension power lines. And so they were building a little industrial area next to this canal when they invented alternating current, and then this project went bust. So then Hooker Chemical Corporation dumped their hazardous waste into this canal and filled it up to the brim, sold it, you guessed it, for $1 to the local school district, and they built a school right on top of this dump. And this dump was leaking through what are called swales, temporary little streams. Sometimes a year they're flowing, in the summer they're bone dry. So these are very, very, unfortunately, common practices from decades gone by. And as you know, hundreds of families were evacuated from the Love Canal. So to answer your question, I think Tom references how many he thinks. I've actually compiled a list of about 1,000 additional sites in the state as a whole. And I'm hoping to release that as soon as I can gather my strength.
Wow.
So let's move back. I'm sorry.